And therefore, my particular centre has, for instance, introduced certification levels for benchmarking, which can move people from a stage of awareness, of understanding what benchmarking is, to proficiency, and then to mastery. Because my advice is that within each organisation, there should be somebody with in-depth knowledge of how to conduct a benchmarking project. So there should be a benchmarking champion. And this particular approach is being promoted now within Singapore through the Civil Service College. So best practice benchmarking is the most powerful type of benchmarking, as long as people are trained in it and know how to use it. I'll now take you through the methodology that I promote, called the Trade Best Practice Benchmarking Methodology. The first stage is to plan the project. The second stage is to undertake research to understand how you currently perform in the area that you're focusing on. The next stage is the act stage, and that means to act and learn from other organisations, find out what they're doing differently. And then once you've identified those better practices, you then deploy them, and then you evaluate whether the project's been successful or not. So trade focuses on the exchange or trade of information and best practices to improve the performance of processes, goods and services. We can break trade down into more detail. And this is why it probably differs from some other benchmarking methodologies, because it's quite prescriptive. Because to do research well, I think we need to have quite a prescriptive methodology. And there are actually 10 steps just for the actual trade stage. Or in fact, 9 steps. The first step is to determine the area of focus for the benchmarking project. Therefore, find out what is your organisation's key strategic needs, or perhaps you've undertaken a self-assessment, you've identified key areas in your organisation that you want to improve, and then it would be ideal to apply benchmarking to those areas. You then develop a project brief, you'd form a project team, you'd train the project team, you'd make sure they all understand what's called the benchmarking code of conduct, so they undertake benchmarking in an ethical manner. You'd then prepare a detailed plan of the project. You'd ensure you've got some documentation system in place so you can retain this knowledge within your organisation. You'd then review that you've completed the terms of process in a professional manner, and then you'd obtain approval from your project sponsor to start the next stage of trade. In terms of the hospital example that we were looking at earlier, it might be that their project aim would be to transport patients safely and quickly from the operating theatre to the intensive care unit. So that's an example of a project aim. And then underneath that, they would have a more detailed plan where they'd identify the team members, the project name, the scope of the project, the background, the objectives, the benefits, the expected costs, the project stakeholders, who's going to be within the team allocated specific tasks as part of the project, what are the training requirements, so on and so forth. So you need a plan in order to do benchmarking well. The second stage is the research stage. Here there is how many steps? Let's just see. There's 5 steps to the research stage. And this is about understanding in more detail the area that you're focusing on. Therefore, for instance, if you're trying to improve employee motivation within your organisation, therefore you have a problem with employee motivation and you want to find best practices in employee motivation, first of all you need to identify how you currently perform. And therefore you'd want to look at your employee turnover levels, your employee absenteeism levels, look at your employee satisfaction results. So the first stage is understanding more about the problem area you're focusing on. You'll then define relevant performance measures, identify current performance, and then you'd review the whole research process to see whether you found out what you need to find out, and then you'll move to the next stage of trade once your project sponsor says, yes, we support this project. In terms of the hospital, perhaps these are the measures they should be using, looking at equipment errors and information errors and the time taken. But what they ought to also identify is that the areas that they really want to focus on and find best practices in is perhaps on equipment transfer, information transfer, and perhaps they want to break that down even further and look at, what sort of training are we providing to our people in terms of this information transfer and equipment transfer. Maybe look at how we're utilizing space. Maybe we need to look at the speed element. Maybe we need to look at how to manage small teams and how we manage safety systems. Because it's important to identify not only the general theme that you're focusing on, but its various components, because that will dictate from which organisations you want to learn from. So for instance, in case of the hospital, they've also identified that utilisation of space is important because they broke their process down into some more detail. And that meant they brought on board a choreographer. If they just kept it at a high level, they might not have identified the opportunity to bring something like that into the project.